Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to ancient Rome, where the scent of blood and sand fills your nostrils as you stand beneath the towering arches of the Colosseum. The roar of 80,000 spectators vibrates through your chest as you clutch unfamiliar weapons with sweaty palms. The brilliant Mediterranean sun beats down on the arena floor where, in just moments, you'll be fighting for your life as a gladiator. Spoiler alert. You're probably not making it out of here alive. Your modern body and mind are woefully unprepared for what's about to happen. If this is helping your restless mind slow down, gently tap that like button and subscribe to our historical sleep journeys. I invite you to share your location and local time in the comments so we can know where our community of dreamers is joining us from. Now, prepare your environment. Reduce the brightness of your room. Rest your eyes momentarily while taking 3 deep breaths, and let's gently navigate together through this narrative that will lead us to rest. You've been transported to ancient Rome during the height of the gladiatorial games, somewhere around 80 CE, just a few years after the completion of the magnificent Flavian amphitheatre we know today as the Colosseum. As you materialize in this strange world, the first thing that hits you is the smell. A pungent cocktail of unwashed bodies, animal dung, exotic spices, and the metallic tang of blood that hangs in the air like a persistent fog. Rome is loud, chaotic, and utterly alien to your modern sensibilities. Within hours of your arrival, you've been captured and sold to a lanista, a gladiator trainer who sees your unusual height and build as potentially profitable. What he doesn't know is that your 21st century body, while perhaps gym-toned, lacks the dense muscle and bone structure developed through a lifetime of physical labor. Romans of this era have been working since childhood, developing powerful frames through constant exertion that your comfortable modern life simply hasn't prepared you for. The lanista examines you like livestock, checking your teeth and muscles with calloused hands that have sent hundreds of men to their deaths. "This one might survive 3 fights," he mutters to his assistant in Latin, a language you're shocked to discover you somehow understand in this strange temporal displacement. 3 fights. The average gladiator survives between 3 and 10 appearances in the arena before meeting their end. Those aren't exactly encouraging odds. Historians have conclusively determined that most gladiators were slaves or condemned criminals, with only about 10% being volunteers who signed contracts for fame and potential fortune. You, however, have no choice in the matter. Your strange appearance and lack of identification marks you as a barbarian from some distant province, perfect fodder for the games. What many don't realize is that gladiators represented a substantial investment for their owners. The lanista who purchased you has paid several thousand sestertii, the equivalent of perhaps 6 months' wages for a skilled laborer. He won't throw that investment away carelessly. You'll be trained, fed, and housed reasonably well, until you're ready to generate a return on his investment by entertaining the masses. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain gladiators may have been women fighting in disguise, though this remains hotly debated among scholars. You wonder if gender swapping might improve your odds, but the thought is fleeting as you're roughly pushed into a wooden cart with other new recruits and driven away from the city centre. Through the slats in the wagon, you catch your first glimpse of the Colosseum rising in the distance, an architectural marvel that will one day stand as a crumbling reminder of Rome's brutal pageantry. But today, it stands intact, gleaming with fresh travertine limestone, adorned with statues and colourful awnings. It's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. "I heard they flood it sometimes," whispers a gaunt man beside you in the cart. "Fill the whole arena with water and stage naval battles with real ships." He's not wrong. Historians still argue about the exact mechanisms, but the Naumachia, staged naval battles, were indeed held in the early years of the Colosseum, though later moved to purpose-built facilities. As the cart rumbles through Rome's crowded streets, you realize with growing dread that you're headed not to the Colosseum itself, but to a training facility outside the city, a ludus, where you'll spend months, perhaps years, being transformed from raw recruit to arena-ready gladiator. If you survive the training, that is. Many don't. The iron gates of the ludus close behind you with a definitive clang that sounds suspiciously like a death knell. Your life as a free person has ended. Your training, and the real struggle to survive, is about to begin. The ludus is a prison masquerading as a training facility, though it bears little resemblance to modern correctional institutions or military boot camps. As you're shoved through its gates, the first assault is on your senses. The acrid smell of sweat, blood, and human waste mingling with the scent of olive oil used to treat wounds and condition leather equipment. The cacophony of men grunting, metal clashing against metal, and trainers barking orders in Latin creates a soundscape that immediately sets your nerves on edge. Your head is roughly shaved, a practical measure against lice rather than a stylistic choice, and you're branded on your forearm with the mark of your Lannister's school. The pain is excruciating, but you quickly learn it's merely an appetizer for what's to come. This permanent marking serves as a constant reminder: you are property now, not a person. Should you attempt to escape, this brand will identify you as a fugitive gladiator, a crime punishable by crucifixion. Training begins before dawn the next day. You're awakened by a bucket of cold water thrown in your face and dragged to the exercise yard. Your first meal, a gruel of barley, beans, and some unidentifiable vegetables, sits heavy in your stomach as you're handed a wooden sword, rudis, that weighs twice as much as a real gladius would. This intentional overweighting is a training technique that will build your muscles and make the real weapon feel light by comparison. But right now, it's simply torture. Historians know that gladiatorial training was systematized to an extraordinary degree, your instructor might explain, if he bothered to speak to you as anything other than prop. We turn farmers into fighters, slaves into spectacles. Well, what he doesn't mention is that the training program was developed over centuries, specifically designed to break your modern body and rebuild it into something ancient and formidable. You're paired with a doctoress, a veteran trainer who might once have been a successful gladiator himself before age or injury ended his combat career. He shows no mercy. When you fail to hold your shield correctly, a wooden staff cracks across your knuckles. When your footwork falters, a kick sends you face first into the sand. Each mistake is punished immediately and painfully, operant conditioning at its most brutal. The first week breaks many recruits. 2 men in your cohort attempt escape. They're caught and crucified outside the ludus as a warning. Another simply collapses during training and never rises again, his heart giving out from the combination of stress, exertion, and likely some congenital defect that modern medicine would have diagnosed, but ancient physicians can only attribute to weak humors. Your modern knowledge of fitness principles is surprisingly useless here. Your attempts to explain proper hydration are met with contempt. Romans believe drinking water during exercise causes cramps and weakness. Your suggestion of rest days for muscle recovery earns you extra lashes. The concept of progressive overload exists here, but in its most primitive form, survive today's training, and tomorrow's will be harder. By the end of the first month, you've lost 15 pounds of fat, but gained only 5 of muscle. Your hands are calloused, your feet blistered, and your back bears the marks of the disciplinarian's whip. The good news? You've survived longer than 20% of your initial cohort. The bad news? The real training hasn't even begun. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain ludus facilities may have employed rudimentary psychological conditioning, including induced sleep deprivation and dietary manipulation to increase aggression. Whether this particular ludus uses such techniques or not becomes irrelevant. The constant fear and physical exhaustion create their own form of psychological breakdown. Your training gradually becomes more specialized as the Lannister and Doctores determine which fighting style best suits your build and natural aptitudes. Tall and relatively lean. Perhaps you'll be trained as a retiarius, fighting with net and trident. Stockier with good endurance. Maybe the heavily armored Murmillo is your destiny. Each gladiator type requires different skills, different muscle development, and comes with its own survival statistics that the Lannister calculates with cold precision. Scholars still debate the exact mortality rates during training the Lannister might mention while examining your progress, but we know it exceeded combat deaths. This isn't encouraging information as you watch another recruit carried away after a practice bout gone wrong. Wooden weapons can still crush skulls when wielded with enough force. The psychological breakdown is perhaps more brutal than the physical. You dream of home, of modern comforts, of a world where violence isn't entertainment, but each morning brings only more training, more pain, more transformation of your body and mind. You begin to forget details of your former life as survival in the present demands your complete attention. By the third month, something strange happens. You begin to improve. Your body, adapting to the constant stress in ways you didn't think possible, develops a type of functional strength different from anything you might have achieved in a modern gym. Your reflexes sharpen. Your pain tolerance increases to alarming levels. You start to understand the rhythm of gladiatorial combat, the economy of movement, the reading of an opponent's intent through subtle shifts in weight or gaze. The Lannister notices too. This one might make it, he tells your Doctores, speaking about you as if you're not present. Start him against the Palus. The wooden post, a gladiator's primary training partner, awaits. You'll spend hours each day striking at it with increasing precision, building muscle memory that might just keep you alive when you finally step into the arena. But for now, survival means enduring. Each day of training breaks something in you while building something new in its place. Your modern identity crumbles as a gladiator emerges, forged in pain, tempered by fear, and still far from ready for what awaits in the Colosseum's blood-soaked sand. 6 months into your training, you've survived the initial culling that claimed nearly a third of your cohort. Your body bears little resemblance to the one that arrived in ancient Rome. Lean muscle has replaced whatever softness remained from your modern life. Scars map the geography of your training mistakes, and your hands have developed calluses so thick they barely register pain anymore. But physical transformation is only the beginning of becoming a true gladiator. Now comes the specialized training that defines your arena identity. The Lannister has decided your fighting style based on your physical attributes and temperament. Perhaps you've been designated a Thraex, Thracian, fighting with a small rectangular shield and curved short sword. Or maybe your height makes you suitable as a Secutor, the traditional opponent of the net-wielding retiarius. Each gladiator type requires entirely different weapon skills, and you're starting from zero. The Gladius Hispanicus wasn't just a sword, your weapons instructor explains, turning the short blade in the sunlight. It was an engineering marvel designed specifically for efficient killing. What he doesn't mention is that effective use of this weapon requires years of muscle memory that Roman legionaries developed through endless drills. You have months. Your first attempts at specialized weapon training are embarrassing. The shield, seemingly simple, proves frustratingly complex. Hold it incorrectly, and your forearm muscles fatigue within minutes. Position it wrongly, and vulnerable areas remain exposed. The gladius, with its distinctive weight distribution optimized for stabbing rather than slashing, feels awkward in your grip. Your instructor demonstrates a simple attack-defense sequence that your modern brain understands conceptually, but your body stumbles through like a toddler learning to walk. Modern audiences often misunderstand gladiatorial combat, a scholarly narrator might interject, imagining wild, chaotic exchanges when in reality, it was a highly technical martial art with specialized techniques developed over centuries. This becomes painfully evident as you struggle to master even basic movements that your fellow trainees, many former soldiers or lifelong slaves accustomed to physical labor, pick up with relative ease. The challenge multiplies when you begin training against moving opponents. Wooden weapons are replaced with blunted metal ones that still leave bruises and minor cuts. Your first sparring session ends within seconds as an experienced gladiator sweeps your legs and places his blunted blade at your throat. "Dead," he says flatly, before walking away. This scenario repeats itself dozens of times daily. Some fringe theories suggest that certain gladiator schools employed blind fighting techniques, training combatants to fight effectively even when vision was impaired. Whether historically accurate or not, your trainers occasionally blindfold you, forcing reliance on hearing and tactile awareness to detect approaching attacks. The first time, you're hit so hard your ribs crack. Recovery means training through the pain. Ancient medicine offers little beyond vinegar-soaked bandages and herbal poultices. By month 8, you've developed some competence with your assigned weapons. Your shield arm no longer trembles from fatigue after a few minutes, and you can execute basic attack combinations with passable technique. But passable isn't survivable. The veteran gladiators watching from the periphery still shake their heads. They can read your movements before you make them, spot the hesitation that telegraphs your attacks, identify the weaknesses in your defense that would be fatal in actual combat. Historians still debate the level of skill the average arena combatant possessed, your instructor might note during a rare rest period. But we know elite gladiators were comparable to modern Olympic athletes in their specialization. Say, this comparison doesn't comfort you as you watch the school's champion dismantle 3 attackers simultaneously in a training exercise. His movements so economical and precise they appear almost casual. The psychological aspect of weapon mastery proves equally challenging. Unlike modern sports where defeat means disappointment, here it means death. This knowledge creates a performance pressure unknown in your previous life. You begin having nightmares where your weapons turn to sand in your hands as opponents advance. The veterans tell you this is normal. The fear never disappears, but you must learn to function despite it. Sometimes, visitors come to the ludus, wealthy Romans considering placing bets on upcoming games. They watch training sessions, assessing potential investments like racing enthusiasts examining horses. During these viewings, the lanista showcases his best fighters and hides his weakest. You're still in the latter category, kept out of sight until your skills improve. These visits remind you of the commercial reality underlying the entire gladiatorial system. You're not just training to survive, you're being groomed as entertainment product. On rare occasions, established gladiators visit from other schools for joint training sessions. These exchanges provide valuable experience fighting against unfamiliar styles, but also highlight how far you still have to go. A retiarius, net fighter, from a prestigious ludus in Capua, entangles 3 of your school's fighters in succession, including one who's been training for over 2 years. The message is clear. There's always someone better, and in the arena, better means still alive. As your first year of training approaches its end, the lanista begins discussing your potential debut. Not in the Colosseum, you're not nearly ready for that grand stage, but in a smaller amphitheater in one of Rome's less prestigious districts. Even this prospect terrifies you. Your weapon skills have improved dramatically from your starting point, but remain rudimentary compared to veterans. You can now last several minutes against experienced fighters in practice bouts, but practice doesn't involve actual killing intent. The night before your scheduled first appearance, another trainee who arrived around the same time as you attempts suicide rather than face the arena. He's unsuccessful and will be sent to the games anyway, but as punishment, he'll face a more skilled opponent with less protective equipment. His fate underscores a brutal truth. The weapons training you've received, while substantial, is nowhere near enough to ensure survival. The gladiators who live to retirement have usually spent a decade or more honing their skills before their first real combat. You lie awake, fingers tracing the unfamiliar contours of your calloused hands, wondering if tomorrow's opponent has 5 years of experience to your 1. The wooden practice sword leaning against your sleeping palate seems a flimsy barrier between life and death, your newly acquired skills insufficient against the specialized training of career gladiators. The sound of the veteran fighters snoring peacefully nearby, men who have survived dozens of combats, only emphasizes the vast gulf in ability that no crash course in weapon mastery can overcome. The living conditions of a gladiator in training contribute as much to your diminishing survival odds as any opponent you'll face in the arena. Your cell, and cell is the appropriate term, not room or quarters, measures roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. You share this claustrophobic space with 2 other trainees, sleeping on straw pallets that harbor fleas, lice, and occasionally rats seeking warmth during colder months. Privacy is non-existent. Bodily functions occur in full view of others, or in rudimentary communal latrines, where disease spreads as freely as conversation. Dawn arrives with the jangling of keys as guards unlock the barracks. You've already been awake for hours, your sleep constantly interrupted by the moans of injured men, the whispered prayers of the terrified, and your own anxiety dreams that jolt you conscious several times each night. Sleep deprivation becomes a chronic condition, dulling your reflexes during training and clouding your decision-making, deficits that will prove fatal in combat if not addressed. Archaeological findings at Ludus sites reveal remarkably sophisticated security measures, a scholarly voice might observe, including strategic architecture designed to prevent escape while maintaining efficient movement of gladiators between training areas. What the archaeological record doesn't capture is how these security features create a constant psychological pressure. Every doorway designed to be easily guarded, every window too small for human passage, every wall topped with shards of pottery that will shred the hands of anyone attempting to climb them. Hygiene represents another slow-motion threat to your survival. The Romans, for all their engineering prowess with public baths and aqueducts, maintained different standards for slaves and gladiators. You're permitted 1 visit to the bathhouse weekly, an insufficient frequency given the intensity of daily training. Between these baths, you rinse with cold water collected in a communal cistern that itself often becomes a breeding ground for bacteria. Skin infections spread rapidly in these conditions. What begins as a small cut during practice develops into a festering wound that oozes pus and radiates heat. Modern antibiotics would clear such infections quickly, but here you're treated with wine poultices and cauterization using heated metal instruments, treatments that sometimes prove more dangerous than the original infection. You watch fellow trainees develop fevers from infected wounds, some slipping into delirium before dying in their sleep. Some fringe historical accounts suggest that certain Ludus facilities may have experimented with herbal antiseptics derived from pine resin or honey. If your training school employs such methods, they represent the cutting edge of ancient medicine, impressive for their time, but woefully inadequate by modern standards. You find yourself mentally cataloguing which plants might have antibiotic properties, but your botanical knowledge rarely extends to practical identification of Mediterranean species. Seasonal challenges further undermine your health. Summer brings scorching heat that turns the training yard into a furnace, causing heat exhaustion and dehydration even among the most conditioned fighters. Winter's damp cold penetrates the poorly insulated barracks, settling into joints and bones, making old injuries throb with renewed pain. The Romans have no concept of vitamin deficiencies, but you recognize the symptoms of scurvy appearing among gladiators who've been in training through the winter months. Bleeding gums, slow healing wounds, joint pain that no amount of massage can alleviate. Scholars continue to debate the exact mortality rates from disease versus combat among gladiators, I note, but evidence suggests illness and infection claimed nearly as many lives as the arena itself. This academic observation takes on grim significance when the man who sleeps beside you develops a racking cough that sprays blood on the straw. Within days, he's gone, carried away without ceremony, his name already forgotten by most, his pallet immediately occupied by a new recruit. The psychological environment proves equally detrimental to your survival prospects. Gladiators form complex social hierarchies, with veterans commanding respect and newcomers suffering ritual humiliations. Your first months feature constant challenges designed to establish your position in this pecking order. Food stolen from your bowl, sleeping space encroached upon, verbal abuse in languages you're only beginning to understand. Fighting back too aggressively brings punishment from the guards. Failing to defend yourself at all marks you as easy prey. Trust becomes a rare commodity. The man training beside you today may be trying to kill you in the arena tomorrow. Friendships form and dissolve based on ever-shifting training assignments and combat schedules. You learn to sleep with one eye open, to count your few possessions obsessively, to suspect kindness as preludes to exploitation. This constant vigilance creates a background stress that slowly erodes your mental. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graveyards reveals that most fighters carried numerous healed fractures and chronic injuries. Your physician mentions, while setting a broken finger you suffered during practice. What he doesn't say is that each injury, even when healed, diminishes your overall fighting capability. The shoulder that dislocated during training never regains its full range of motion. The broken ribs create a permanent vulnerability on your left side. The concussion suffered last month still causes occasional double vision during rapid movements. By your 15th month in the ludus, your body has accumulated a catalogue of damage that would concern modern sports medicine specialists. The Romans have no concept of physiotherapy or rehabilitation protocol. Injuries heal imperfectly, creating compensatory movement patterns that lead to secondary problem. Veterans move with distinctive hitches and favors, visible maps of their combat history, bodily records of near-death experiences survived at permanent cost. Most insidious of all is the gradual normalization of your circumstances. The shock and horror that characterized your early days fades into resigned acceptance. The sight of blood no longer turns your stomach. The screams of men in the infirmary don't interrupt your meals. You catch yourself calculating odds of survival with detached interest, assessing new recruits with the same coldly appraising eye that once evaluated you. This psychological adaptation helps you function in the short term, but represents another piece of your modern self being carved away. The gladiator's mindset remains one of history's most fascinating psychological studies, a scholarly voice might observe. How does a person adapt to living in constant proximity to their potential death? The answer becomes clearer with each passing day. You adapt by becoming someone else entirely, someone your former self would barely recognize. Someone who might actually survive in the arena, though at the cost of everything that once defined you. Barley men. That's what Roman citizens mockingly call gladiators, referencing the grain-heavy diet that forms the foundation of your nutrition program. As you sit before your daily meal of pulmentum, a thick barley porridge mixed with beans, occasionally supplemented with vegetables and small amounts of meat, you contemplate how this specialized eating regimen is simultaneously building and undermining your survival chances. The gladiator diet represents one of history's earliest examples of performance nutrition, specifically designed to create bodies that could withstand combat trauma. Your daily caloric intake exceeds what most Roman citizens consume, though the macronutrient balance would horrify modern nutritionists. Approximately 70% of your calories come from carbohydrates, primarily barley and beans, with limited protein and fat, except in one surprising area. Archaeological analysis of Gladiator remains, reveals higher bone density than the general population. A physician might explain while checking your healing collarbone fracture. We build a protective layer under your skin. What he's describing, in pre-scientific terms, is the development of subcutaneous fat, a deliberately cultivated padding that protects blood vessels and vital organs from glancing blows. This fat layer is strategically advantageous, but comes with performance consequences your modern body struggles to adapt to. Your training regimen demands explosive power, endurance, and strength, attributes that conflict with the weight gain promoted by your diet. You feel simultaneously stronger and slower as the months progress, your muscles developing beneath a protective layer that also restricts your mobility compared to your leaner, pre-gladiator physique. This trade-off might benefit a combatant born and raised in ancient Rome, but your modern musculature and nervous system struggle with the adjustment. The dietary supplementation provided is equally foreign to your system. Each morning, you're given a concoction that trainers claim enhances bone healing, likely a mixture of calcium-rich ingredients like ground shells or animal bone ash mixed with vinegar or wine. While not entirely ineffective, these supplements pale in comparison to modern nutrition science, and your body registers the difference. Micronutrient deficiencies develop gradually, manifesting as increased susceptibility to illness, delayed wound healing, and chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to resolve. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests certain gladiator schools might have experimented with regional variations in fighter diets. Schools in Greek territories incorporated more olive oil and fish, while northern provinces emphasized meat proteins. Your ludus, unfortunately, follows traditional Roman practices with strict adherence to the barley-based regimen, regardless of your body's individual response. The psychological impact of this dietary protocol extends beyond physical consequences. The monotony of eating virtually identical meals day after day creates a peculiar form of sensory deprivation. You find yourself dreaming about foods from your modern life, not just delicacies, but simple variations in texture and flavor that ancient Rome cannot provide. This dietary homogeneity gradually diminishes your sensory acuity, contributing to the psychological flattening that makes acceptable the otherwise unacceptable conditions of gladiatorial life. Water consumption presents another survival challenge. The Romans have sophisticated aqueduct systems, but water quality varies dramatically based on your location in the social hierarchy. As a gladiator, you drink water stored in lead-lined cisterns or transported through lead pipes, exposure that creates cumulative neurotoxicity. Your modern body, unaccustomed to heavy metal contamination, reacts more severely than your Roman-born counterparts. You experience headaches, concentration difficulties, and occasional tremors that training masters attribute to fear but actually stem from low-level lead poisoning. Historians still debate the exact impact of lead exposure on Roman society, a scholarly voice might inject, but evidence suggests gladiators received higher exposures than average citizens due to their concentrated housing and training facility. This academic observation translates to very real cognitive impairment that might mean the difference between life and death when split-second decisions are required in the arena. During high-intensity training periods, you're provided with posca, a diluted vinegar drink that functions as an ancient sports beverage. While it does help replace electrolytes lost through sweat, its extreme acidity gradually damages your tooth enamel, creating painful sensitivity and eventually contributing to dental abscesses that further undermine your overall health. Your training partners display various stages of dental deterioration, with veterans often missing multiple teeth, a cosmetic issue that becomes tactically relevant when protective mouthguards don't fit properly. The timing of meals creates additional physiological stress. You eat twice daily on a rigid schedule, disconnected from your body's needs or training demands. Heavy morning meals before intense exercise frequently lead to nausea and vomiting, while evening meals often come hours after your glycogen stores have been depleted, leaving your body in a catabolic state that breaks down hard-earned muscle mass. You recognize these problems from your modern knowledge of sports nutrition, but have no authority to modify your feeding schedule. Seasonal variations in food quality present further challenges. Winter months bring storage-stable options like dried legumes and preserved meats, while nutritional quality declines as fresh produce becomes scarce. By late winter, subtle symptoms of vitamin deficiencies appear throughout the ludus: bleeding gums, slow-healing wounds, night blindness, problems that would be easily prevented with modern supplements but represent potentially deadly disadvantages in ancient Rome. The Gladiator diet does offer one surprising benefit. The high strontium content of the vegetable-based regimen promotes bone healing, giving you marginally better recovery from fractures than you'd experience on a modern Western diet. This advantage, however, comes paired with decreased iron absorption due to the phytate content of whole grains, leading to chronic mild anemia that manifests as exercise intolerance and cognitive fog, hardly conducive to arena survival. Archaeological evidence has revealed that gladiators consumed a plant ash drink after training, your lanista mentions casually while inspecting your progress. This detail, confirmed by calcium deposits in gladiator remains, represents an early understanding of electrolyte replacement. The drink, while beneficial for preventing cramps, tastes so vile that you sometimes secretly skip it, unwittingly undermining your own recovery in exchange for momentary relief from its chalky, alkaline flavor. As your debut combat approaches, you're placed on a specialized pre-fight nutritional protocol. Portions increase, protein content rises marginally, and you're given small amounts of diluted wine believed to enhance courage. This diet, while performance-focused by ancient standards, creates gastrointestinal distress that adds another layer of anxiety to your pre-combat preparation. The carbohydrate loading leaves you feeling bloated and sluggish during final training sessions, sensations that do little to build confidence in your fighting capabilities. The night before your scheduled arena appearance, you lie awake contemplating how thoroughly your body has been transformed by the gladiatorial diet. You're heavier, with thicker padding over your abdominal region, stronger in absolute terms but less agile than when you arrived. Chronic nutrient deficiencies have left your skin dry and hair brittle. Your immune system operates at reduced capacity, and subtle cognitive changes affect your memory and reaction time. You've been remade into something between athlete and spectacle, your body modified to withstand damage for maximum entertainment value rather than optimal performance or longevity. You first encounter ancient Roman medicine, not in the arena, but in the infirmary of the ludus, after a training accident leaves you with a deep gash across your forearm. The medicus, the gladiatorial physician, approaches your injury with a confidence that momentarily reassures you until you observe his methods. He begins by washing the wound, not with sterile saline, but with vinegar and wine, a combination that sends searing pain through your arm, but does provide some limited antiseptic benefit. The Romans understood wound cleaning was essential, he might have king, though they attributed its benefits to balancing humors rather than preventing infection. What he doesn't mention is that his understanding of human physiology is based on a combination of practical observation and wildly inaccurate theories about bodily functions. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, form the foundation of his medical knowledge, a framework that occasionally leads to helpful treatments, but just as often results in interventions that actively harm the patient. As he prepares to close your wound, you realize with growing horror that there are no sterile sutures, no antibiotics, and no anesthesia beyond a cup of strong wine you're instructed to drink quickly. The needle he produces is made of bronze, the thread of animal sinew, or plant fiber that has been soaked in wine, but is decidedly not sterile by modern standards. Each stitch sends waves of pain through your body, requiring every ounce of self-control to remain still as the wound is closed. The aftermath of even this relatively minor injury highlights the critical vulnerabilities your modern body faces in ancient Rome. The wound site becomes hot and swollen within days, the telltale signs of infection that would prompt immediate antibiotic treatment in your time. Here, your swelling is packed with a poultice of bread mold and honey, ironically containing trace amounts of natural antibiotics, but far too dilute to effectively combat the infection. Your modern immune system, while robust against contemporary pathogens, has no evolutionary defenses against ancient bacterial strains that disappeared or mutated long before your birth. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain gladiatorial physicians may have possessed surprisingly advanced knowledge of herbal antibacterials, using specific combinations of garlic, honey, and mold to create treatments that prefigured modern antibiotics by millennia. Whether your ludus employs such enlightened practitioners becomes literally a matter of life and death as your infection progresses. Historians continue to debate the relative effectiveness of Roman medical practices compared to their contemporaries, a scholarly voice might observe. This academic equivocation takes on grim significance as you develop a fever that modern thermometers would register at 103 degrees, but is assessed here by the physician's hand placed on your forehead. The subjective nature of this diagnosis means your treatment varies based on the medicus's personal experience and temperament, rather than objective measurement. Surgical interventions represent another area where ancient medicine fails to protect your modern. When another trainee suffers a compound fracture during practice, you witness a bone-setting procedure that makes your stomach turn. The physician manually manipulates the broken bone back into position without anesthesia, the patient screams muffled by a leather strap placed between his teeth. The wound is then packed with various substances, wine-soaked linen, honey, and herb mixtures, before being bound with wooden splints. Remarkably, many of these fractures do heal, though rarely with the alignment that modern orthopedic surgery would achieve. You begin noticing how veteran gladiators often display subtle asymmetries, shoulders that don't quite match in height, arms that bend at slightly different angles, legs of marginally different lengths. These imperfections, while not immediately disabling, create biomechanical inefficiencies that compound over time, contributing to chronic pain and eventually diminished fighting capability. Concussions and head injuries receive particularly inadequate treatment by modern standards. When you're struck in the head during training, seeing stars and experiencing momentary confusion, the response is simply to sit in the shade until the symptoms subside. No concussion protocol exists. No understanding of the cumulative damage of repeated head trauma informs training practices. Veterans sometimes display characteristics you recognize as consistent with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, mood swings, memory problems, slurred speech, though such symptoms are attributed to divine disfavor or personal moral failings rather than brain injury. Archaeological examination of gladiator remains reveals a pattern of healed cranial fractures consistent with repeated head trauma, a researcher might note. This clinical observation translates to a reality where your brain is regularly rattled inside your skull, each impact causing microscopic damage that accumulates without the rest and recovery modern medicine would prescribe. Your cognitive functions, reaction time, judgment, emotional regulation gradually deteriorate, creating a downward spiral where diminished performance leads to more injuries, which further impair performance. Dental care presents another survival challenge. Tooth decay and gum disease run rampant in the ludus, with treatments limited to extraction for advanced cases. The pain of an abscessed tooth can be debilitating, yet you're still expected to train through this discomfort. Tooth loss creates tactical vulnerabilities. gaps that can catch a glancing blow from an opponent's shield and tear your lip or cheek. It also impairs nutrition, as your ability to chew certain foods diminishes, further undermining your physical condition in subtle but significant ways. The Roman understanding of disease transmission presents perhaps the greatest threat to your modern body. With no germ theory to inform hygiene practices, contagious illnesses spread rapidly through the close quarters of the loop. Your first winter brings an outbreak of what might be influenza, sweeping through the barracks and claiming the lives of several trainees. Your modern immune system, while robust against contemporary viral strains, lacks specific antibodies for these ancient variants, potentially leaving you more vulnerable than your Roman-born counterparts. Internal injuries receive particularly ineffective treatment. When a training partner suffers what you suspect is a ruptured spleen from a shield bash, the physicians apply heated cups to his abdomen to draw out the bad humors, followed by herbal concoctions meant to restore balance to his system. You watch with helpless knowledge as he deteriorates over days, eventually succumbing to internal bleeding that modern emergency surgery would likely have repaired. His death serves as a grim reminder that injuries survivable in your time often amount to death sentences here. Perhaps most insidious are the well-intentioned treatments that actually cause harm. Lead and mercury feature prominently in various medicinal compounds, creating cumulative toxicity with each application. Bloodletting, the deliberate removal of excess blood to balance humors, weakens patients already compromised by injury or illness. Purgatives and emetics designed to cleanse the body often result in dangerous dehydration and electrolyte imbalances that further complicate recovery. As your time in the ludus extends, you develop a conflicted relationship with the medical staff. Their treatments occasionally provide genuine relief, particularly for pain management through opium derivatives and wine. Yet you also witness enough iatrogenic harm, damage caused by medical intervention itself, to approach every treatment with trepidation. This medical Russian roulette represents yet another way your survival chances diminish with each passing month, each injury bringing not just its direct consequences, but the unpredictable outcomes of ancient treatments your modern body was never designed to endure. 3 days before your scheduled arena debut, you find yourself unable to sleep. The barracks around you resonate with the sounds of men in various states of psychological distress, some praying in whispered tones to gods you've never heard of, others staring blankly at the ceiling, a few weeping quietly into their pallets. This shared anxiety creates a contagious atmosphere of dread that amplifies your own fears. What modern psychologists would recognize as anticipatory anxiety and acute stress response, the Romans simply call pre-battle nerves and consider a natural, even necessary part of the gladiatorial experience. The psychological preparation of gladiators was as structured as their physical training, a scholarly account might note. What this academic observation fails to capture is the deliberate psychological warfare conducted against you by the ludus staff. Your training schedule intensifies as your debut approaches, not to improve your skills, which are largely established by now, but to exhaust you physically, so you'll sleep despite your anxiety. The quality of your meals diminishes slightly, creating mild hunger that keeps your thoughts focused on immediate discomforts rather than existential threats. Guards discuss your upcoming match within earshot, casually placing bets on your survival with callous disregard for your presence. Your opponent remains unknown to you, a deliberate tactic that prevents specific preparation and maximizes uncertainty. You're told only their gladiatorial class, perhaps a heavily armored Mumio if you've been trained as an agile Thraex, or a Retiarius with net and trident if you're a Secutor. This matchup follows traditional pairings designed to create visually interesting combat with contrasting fighting styles, but the mystery surrounding your specific opponent forces your mind to conjure increasingly terrifying possibilities during quiet moments. the psychological manipulation extends beyond the ludus walls. On the day before your fight, you're paraded through the streets of Rome along with other debuting gladiators, not yet a spectacle of combat, but rather of potential. Citizens examine you like livestock, commenting openly on your physical attributes, placing informal wagers on your performance, sometimes throwing small objects to test your reflexes or temperament. This preview serves multiple purposes, generating interest in tomorrow's games, allowing gamblers to assess the merchandise, and crucially, forcing you to confront the public nature of your coming ordeal. Some fringe historical accounts suggest that certain ludus operations employed specialized psychological tactics, including controlled exposure to the arena before combat. Whether this practice applies in your case becomes clear when your trainer takes you to the Colosseum during non-event hours, allowing you to stand in the center of the massive amphitheater, feeling the crushing weight of empty seats that tomorrow will hold tens of thousands of spectators. The acoustics of the space are demonstrated when he drops a wooden sword on the sand, the small sound somehow magnified by the architecture, emphasizing how every grunt, cry of pain, or gasped breath will be clearly audible to the crowd. Scholars remain divided on whether gladiators were primarily motivated by fear of death or hope for glory, an academic voice might observe. This theoretical debate materializes in very practical terms through the dual messaging you receive. Guards remind you that disappointing performances are often punished with death, while trainers simultaneously dangle potential rewards, better food, improved living quarters, even eventual freedom, for exemplary showings. This carrot and stick approach creates a psychological conflict between avoidance and approach motivations, a tension that makes restful sleep impossible as your mind cycles endlessly between fear and ambition. The veteran gladiators contribute to this psychological pressure in contradictory ways. Some offer genuine advice drawn from their survival experiences, tips on pleasing the crowd, warnings about common mistakes made by novices, suggestions for playing to the editors, event sponsors' sensibilities. Others seem to delight in terrorizing new fighters with graphic descriptions of arena deaths they've witnessed or inflicted. A few maintain superstitious silence around debuting gladiators, considering them already dead until proven otherwise through survival. This social environment creates additional confusion as you attempt to determine which veterans offer helpful counsel and which are simply adding to your psychological burden for their own amusement. Your modern understanding of psychological principles provides little protection against these ancient manipulations. You recognize the sleep deprivation, understand the effects of uncertainty on anxiety levels, can name the cognitive distortions being encouraged. But this analytical awareness doesn't prevent the physiological responses of your autonomic nervous system. Your heart races, your palms sweat, your digestion becomes disturbed, and your thoughts scatter in directions unhelpful for the life or death test awaiting you. The night before combat introduces a peculiar Roman tradition, the cena libera, or free dinner, where condemned gladiators receive a final elaborate meal. While technically reserved for criminals sentenced to die in the arena, rather than professional gladiators, the practice has expanded to include all fighters making their debuts. The meal is surprisingly lavish compared to your usual fare, including meats, fruits, and watered wine. The unstated implication hangs over the proceedings. Enjoy these pleasures now, as they may be your last. Some fighters overindulge, seeking momentary comfort through food and drink. Others, including you, find their appetites diminished by anxiety, picking at dishes while trying to appear appropriately grateful. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries reveals distinctive burial practices, a researcher might observe, with certain ritual objects suggesting spiritual preparation for potential death. This academic footnote takes on immediate relevance when a priest visits after dinner, offering blessings and accepting small personal items. Some fighters wish buried with them should they fall. You have little from your modern life to offer, but watching your fellow gladiators engage in this grim preparation makes the possibility of death tomorrow undeniably concrete. Sleep, when it finally comes, brings no rest. Your dreams fill with fragmented combat scenarios, each ending differently. Sometimes with victory, often with defeat, occasionally with scenarios so bizarre they could only emerge from an overtaxed mind, processing extreme stress. You wake repeatedly, each time needing a moment to remember where and when you are, each realization bringing fresh waves of anxiety that make returning to sleep increasingly difficult. Dawn arrives with ritualized efficiency. You're washed, your body oiled, your hair arranged according to the traditions of your fighter class. Assistants help you don your armor, explaining that the actual combat equipment differs slightly from training gear. Sharper edges, different weight distribution, fewer protective elements than you've grown accustomed to. These differences, introduced deliberately at the last moment, create additional uncertainty that further undermines your confidence. The journey to the arena passes in a blur of sensory impressions. The morning light on stone buildings, the curious gazes of citizens, the smell of sacrificial incense from temples, the gradually increasing volume of the crowd as you approach the Colosseum. Your modern mind attempts to process these experiences through familiar frameworks, comparing the moment to pre-game nerves before athletic competitions or stage fright before performances. But these comparisons collapse under the fundamental difference that separates gladiatorial combat from any modern experience: the very real, state-sanctioned possibility that you will not survive the day. As you wait in the hippodrome, the complex of rooms and passages beneath the arena floor, the psychological pressure reaches its peak. The sounds of the crowd filter down, punctuated by occasional roars that signal significant moments in the preliminary events. Your imagination supplies vivid details for these unseen contests, each visualized death or injury becoming a possible preview of your own fate. Around you, other fighters engage in personal rituals, prayers, repetitive movements, silent meditation, seeking psychological refuge through practiced behaviors that provide illusions of control over the uncontrollable. When your name is finally called, you rise automatically, your body moving through ingrained training routines, while your mind remains curiously detached. This dissociative response, a psychological defense mechanism against overwhelming stress, carries you up the ramp toward the arena floor. Modern sports psychology would recognize this state as similar to flow or being in the zone, but with a critical difference. Rather than enhancing performance through focused attention, this stress-induced dissociation introduces a dangerous gap between perception and response that may well prove fatal when the combat begins. The arena floor feels nothing like the training yard. Your first step onto actual Colosseum sand, imported at great expense from Egypt for its perfect golden color and superior absorption qualities, sends a shock through your system. It's deeper than expected, approximately 2 inches rather than the packed dirt you've trained on, creating subtle but significant changes in your balance and movement. Each step requires marginally more energy, a small disadvantage that compounds with every maneuver you'll attempt. Sunlight streams through the velarium, the massive canvas awning that provides partial shade for spectators, while leaving fighters exposed to the full intensity of Mediterranean sun. The glare creates visibility challenges your training never accounted for, with shadows and bright patches alternating across the arena as the fabric ripples in the breeze. You squint against the brightness, knowing your opponent might emerge from a shadowed area, momentarily invisible until fatally close. The Colosseum featured sophisticated environmental controls, a historical account might mention, including systems for introducing water, scenery, and animals into the arena. What this academic observation fails to convey is how these elements create unpredictable fighting conditions. Portions of the sand feel slightly damp from earlier aquatic displays, creating patches where footing becomes treacherously unstable. The scent of exotic animals still lingers in certain areas, a cognitive distraction as your brain instinctively processes potential predator cues while trying to focus on human combat. Your opponent emerges from the opposite entrance, and the crowd's response provides your first psychological advantage or disadvantage. Their cheers or jeers indicate whether you face a beloved champion or despised novice, information that immediately influences your The editor of the games, the wealthy patron financing today's spectacle, watches from a prominent position, his reactions carrying particular weight in determining your fate should you lose but fight well enough to merit mercy. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain arena surfaces may have concealed trapdoors used to introduce surprise elements during combats. Whether factual or merely rumor, the possibility of such mechanisms creates additional psychological pressure as you scan the ground for telltale signs of hidden dangers while trying to maintain awareness of your approaching opponent. The architecture of the Colosseum itself becomes an active participant in your struggle for survival. The curved walls provide no corner to retreat into, ensuring you remain visible from all angles. The acoustics amplify every sound. Your breathing seems unnaturally loud in your ears, while the crowd's reactions hit like physical forces, waves of noise that disrupt concentration at critical moments. The barrier between arena floor and spectator seating stands 15 feet high, topped with horizontal rollers to prevent desperate fighters from climbing out. A visual reminder that there is no escape except through victory or death. Historians continue to debate the exact nature of the subsurface structures beneath the Colosseum arena. A scholarly voice might interject. This academic uncertainty manifests as practical danger when you back over a section where the sand feels slightly different underfoot, perhaps covering a wooden panel rather than solid stone. These subtle variations in the fighting surface create unpredictable footing that makes trained combat sequences dangerously unreliable. Environmental hazards extend beyond structural elements to include deliberate arena dressing. Small weapons may be scattered across the sand, daggers or tridents abandoned from previous matches that become impromptu options for a disarmed fighter. These items rarely appear in the same location twice, making it impossible to plan for their availability. Broken equipment from earlier contests creates debris that must be navigated while maintaining combat awareness. Tiny obstacles that can cause a fatal stumble if stepped on during a critical evasive movement. Temperature becomes a significant factor as your match progresses. The arena floor, exposed to direct sunlight, reaches temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit during summer matches. Your metal armor components become painfully hot against your skin, creating first-degree burns along contact points. Sweat quickly soaks the padding beneath your armor, adding weight and friction that wasn't present when you began. Dehydration accelerates as your body attempts to cool itself, gradually impairing cognitive function and muscle performance in ways you can feel but cannot counteract. The sand itself becomes a weapon against you. Initially pristine, it quickly becomes disturbed by combat movements, creating uneven surfaces that twist ankles and destabilize carefully practiced footwork. Blood from minor wounds, yours or your opponent's, mixes with the sand, creating slick patches that provide treacherous footing. Dust kicked up during vigorous exchanges temporarily blinds or disorients, creating vulnerability windows that experienced gladiators exploit instinctively, but that you're still learning to anticipate. Archaeological evidence indicates that arena sand was regularly replaced between combat events, a researcher might note, sometimes colored with cinnabar to conceal blood or enhance visual drama. This scholarly detail becomes grimly relevant when you realize the apparent freshness of the sand beneath your feet doesn't mean this is the day's first match, only that crews have quickly raked over evidence of previous combat while you waited in the holding area. The ground may contain hidden slick spots where blood has soaked deeper than the replaced surface layer. Spatial awareness becomes increasingly challenging as the combat continues. The Colosseum's oval shape creates perceptual distortions, different from the square training yards you're accustomed to. Distances to the barrier appear shorter than they actually are, causing miscalculations when attempting to use the arena's boundaries tactically. Your opponent may have fought here many times before, understanding instinctively how to leverage these spatial peculiarities while you waste precious mental resources consciously adjusting to the unfamiliar environment. Weather introduces another variable entirely outside your control. A sudden gust of wind might blow sand into your eyes at a critical moment. Cloud cover passing over the Colosseum changes light conditions instantaneously, requiring rapid visual adaptation that momentarily distracts from combat awareness. Rain, while rare during scheduled games, creates its own hazards when it occurs, transforming the arena floor into a muddy surface that nullifies hours of practice spent perfecting movements on dry ground. The hypogym, the complex underground structure beneath the arena floor, contributes its own set of hazards. Animals awaiting later appearances in the games create disturbing noises that rise through the wooden arena floor, roars and growls that trigger primal fear responses at unexpected moments. Machinery operating below sometimes causes subtle vibrations underfoot, barely perceptible, but sufficient to disrupt the perfect balance needed for certain fighting techniques. Scholarly interpretation of surviving text suggests that some arena combats included theatrical elements, with fighters adopting dramatic personas or storylines an academic might observe. This historical footnote has immediate consequences when you realize your opponent has been cast as your narrative opposite, perhaps representing a historical enemy of Rome if you're fighting in the barbarian style, or embodying a mythological adversary if your combat has been themed around classical legends. These imposed narratives create subtle pressure to fight in ways that satisfy the dramatic expectations of the audience, rather than maximizing your survival chances. Time functions differently in the arena than in training. What felt like fluid, continuous action during practice now fragments into intense bursts of engagement, separated by circling assessment periods. Each exchange lasts mere seconds, but contains dozens of micro-decisions that determine survival. The pacing becomes another opponent. Fighting too aggressively leads to rapid exhaustion in the punishing heat, while excessive caution antagonizes the crowd and editor. Finding the balance between these extremes requires experience you haven't had time to develop. As your match progresses, the accumulated environmental challenges begin extracting their toll. Minor wounds bleed more profusely due to increased heart rate and dehydration. Fatigue diminishes precision, making each subsequent exchange marginally more dangerous than the last. The sand, initially an aesthetic surface, becomes a record of the combat narrative. Footprints showing retreat and advance, dark patches marking where blood has fallen, disturbed areas indicating where bodies have briefly touched the ground. This evolving landscape requires constant adaptation, consuming mental resources already depleted by the stress of combat itself. The crowd's reactions become increasingly important as the match continues, their favor potentially determining your fate should you find yourself at your opponent's mercy. Spectacular movements or unusual techniques generate positive responses even if tactically questionable, creating the perverse incentive to occasionally fight for theatrical effect rather than maximum effectiveness. This tension between survival and entertainment represents yet another environmental hazard unique to arena combat, a psychological factor absent from any modern combat sport. Your first real combat exchange in the arena reveals the vast gulf between training sequences and actual gladiatorial fighting. The practice patterns that seem so effective in the ludus suddenly dissolve against an opponent who hasn't memorized your school's attack combinations. Your initial offensive sequence, A shield feint followed by a diagonal slash that worked consistently against training partners is met with an entirely unexpected counter that nearly ends the fight before it truly begins. Only instinctive reaction saves you from immediate defeat, your body responding before your conscious mind processes the danger. Roman gladiatorial combat represented one of history's most refined fighting systems, a historical account might note, with techniques developed through generations of life or death testing. What this academic observation fails to capture is how these refined techniques have been internalized by veteran fighters through thousands of hours of practice and dozens of actual combats. Experience your crash course in gladiatorial training cannot possibly replicate. Your opponent moves with an economy of motion that betrays their extensive arena history. Each step and gesture precisely calibrated for maximum efficiency with minimum exertion. The fundamental physics of ancient combat works against your modern instincts. The weight distribution of gladiatorial weapons, optimized for killing efficiency rather than safety or practice, creates momentum patterns different from anything you've trained with. Your shield, lighter than training versions to allow greater mobility in actual combat, provides less protective coverage than you've become accustomed to. These equipment differences, introduced deliberately on the day of combat, require real-time adaptation that consumes precious cognitive resources better devoted to tactical decision-making. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain gladiator types may have employed specialized techniques not recorded in mainstream historical accounts, pressure point strikes, joint manipulations, or targeting specific anatomical vulnerabilities. Whether your opponent possesses such esoteric knowledge becomes apparent when they execute a maneuver you've never witnessed in training, targeting the gap between armor pieces with disturbing precision that suggests intimate familiarity with gladiatorial equipment vulnerabilities. The speed of actual combat exceeds anything you experienced in training. What appeared as distinct movements during practice, block, step, thrust, recover, blends into continuous flowing action that challenges your perceptual processing. Modern neuroscience would explain this as your visual and cognitive systems struggling to pass information, arriving too quickly for complete processing, creating dangerous gaps between perception and response. Your opponent, having experienced this perceptual challenge in multiple previous combats, has developed compensatory mechanisms that allow them to function effectively despite these limitations. Historians continue to debate the relative importance of offense versus defense in gladiatorial fighting styles, a scholarly voice might observe. This academic discussion materializes in very practical terms, as you notice your opponent maintains a defensive posture significantly more conservative than anything demonstrated in your training. The reason becomes clear when you successfully land a minor cut on their thigh. They absorb this small injury without reaction, recognizing it as tactically insignificant, while waiting for you to create a more substantial opening. This strategic patience, developed through actual combat experience rather than theoretical training, creates a methodical approach to fighting that prioritizes survival over spectacle. The biomechanics of ancient combat techniques reveal their evolutionary refinement through your opponent's movements. Their sword arm generates power primarily from torso rotation rather than the limb itself, creating striking force that exceeds what muscle mass alone would suggest possible. Their footwork maintains constant balance through micro-adjustments invisible to casual observation, but representing critical adaptations to arena conditions. Shield positioning accounts for both immediate defensive needs and anticipated follow-up attacks, representing a temporal awareness developed through extensive combat experience. Your training emphasized standardized responses to common attacks, creating muscle memory for efficient defense. In actual combat, however, you discover the infinite variations possible within these standard attacks. Slight changes in angle, timing, or commitment that transform familiar scenarios into novel threats. Your opponent executes textbook techniques, but with subtle personal modifications developed through their fighting career. Idiosyncrasies that render your prepared responses dangerously incomplete. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graves reveals distinctive patterns of healed injuries, a researcher might note, suggesting specialized targeting of non-lethal areas to prolong combats. This clinical observation translates to the disturbing realization that your opponent is deliberately extending the fight, rather than pursuing immediately decisive actions. They target peripheral areas, shallow cuts to limbs, glancing blows that disorient without disabling. Techniques designed to create a gradually accumulating disadvantage, while providing maximum entertainment value for the spectators. This performance aspect of combat represents a dimension entirely absent from your training, which focused exclusively on technical effectiveness rather than theatrical presentation. The psychological dimension of gladiatorial combat emerges as perhaps the most significant factor separating trained technique from combat effectiveness. Your opponent employs subtle psychological tactics, rhythmic patterns of attack suddenly broken to exploit anticipatory responses, momentary displays of false vulnerability that become traps when pursued, exaggerated reactions to minor wounds that encourage overconfidence. These manipulation techniques, invisible to spectators but devastatingly effective against inexperienced fighters, represent a meta layer of combat sophistication that transcends physical technique entirely. Stamina management becomes increasingly crucial as the combat progresses. Your opponent maintains consistent energy expenditure through practiced efficiency, while your own efforts become increasingly desperate and energy-intensive as initial exchanges prove less effective than expected. Modern sports science would identify this as the difference between aerobic and anaerobic exertion. Your frequent bursts of maximum effort rapidly deplete glucose reserves and build up lactic acid, while your opponent's measured approach allows sustainable output through oxygen-based energy production. This metabolic advantage, developed through years of conditioning specific to gladiatorial combat, creates a widening performance gap as the fight continues. Weapon handling reveals another dimension of combat refinement beyond formal technique. Your opponent's sword moves as a natural extension of their body, the years of daily practice evident in how the blade anticipates rather than follows their tactical intentions. Your own weapon, while identical in design, remains stubbornly external to your neuromuscular system, requiring conscious direction rather than responding to intuitive control. This integration difference, impossible to develop in your limited training time, creates fractional delays between intention and execution that become literal life or death margins in the compressed time frame of combat exchanges. Scholarly analysis of gladiatorial combat suggests fighters developed individualized tactical approaches based on personal attributes and fighting style, an academic might observe. This theoretical diversity becomes painfully concrete when your opponent employs tactics specifically calibrated to exploit weaknesses in your particular gladiator type. If you're fighting as a retiarius, net fighter, they maintain precise distance control that neutralizes your range advantage. If you're a heavily armored mumio, they target mobility restrictions created by your protective equipment. This specialized counterfighting represents tactical depth developed through observation of countless combats, analytical sophistication impossible to develop in your abbreviated training period. Environmental adaptation separates veteran fighters from novices in ways training cannot replicate. Your opponent instinctively positions themselves to keep the sun in your eyes, exploits subtle variations in the arena surface that affect footing, and times aggressive advances to coincide with crowd surges that temporarily mask their movement with noise. These situational awareness capabilities, developed through repeated arena experiences, create compounding advantages independent of technical skill, a parallel combat dimension your training has barely acknowledged, much less developed. The culmination of these combat refinements manifests in your opponent's ability to create and exploit decision paralysis. They present tactical problems with no good solutions. Situations where every defensive option creates a new vulnerability, where offensive opportunities carry prohibitive risks, where hesitation and action seem equally dangerous. This decision pressure represents psychological combat at its most sophisticated, creating brief moments of cognitive overload that disable your tactical reasoning precisely when it's most needed. Modern neuroscience would explain this as analysis paralysis under threat conditions. But understanding the mechanism provides no protection against its effects when your brain's processing capacity is already overwhelmed by the multidimensional challenges of actual combat. As your match continues, these technical and psychological disadvantages compound with each exchange. Minor wounds accumulate, each slightly limiting your movement options and draining physical resources. Fatigue gradually diminishes technique quality, creating widening gaps between intended and executed movement. The psychological pressure of facing a clearly superior opponent generates anticipatory stress responses that further accelerate physical deterioration. This downward spiral, familiar to your opponent through observation of countless previous novices, represents the almost inevitable trajectory of your first arena appearance. A harsh demonstration that combat techniques refined through centuries of life or death testing cannot be effectively acquired through even the most intensive crash course in gladiatorial training. The crowd's roar swells as your opponent lands a particularly impressive strike, opening a shallow cut across your thigh. It's not a fatal wound, barely deep enough to draw blood, but the audience's reaction carries greater significance than the physical damage. You've just received your first lesson in the complex relationship between gladiatorial combat and public entertainment, where technical proficiency matters less than dramatic narrative. Roman spectators possessed sophisticated understanding of gladiatorial combat, a historical account might note, with specific expectations regarding different fighter types and match progressions. What this academic observation fails to capture is how thoroughly these expectations determine your survival chances, regardless of your actual fighting ability. The crowd doesn't merely watch your performance, they actively participate in judging its entertainment value, their collective assessment potentially overriding the combat outcome itself. You quickly discover that certain actions generate disproportionately positive audience responses. Aggressive advances, even tactically unsound ones, elicit approving shouts. Stoic endurance of injuries earns respectful murmurs. Flashy techniques with minimal combat effectiveness nonetheless generate enthusiastic applause. This feedback creates a perverse incentive structure where fighting to survive and fighting to please the crowd become separate, sometimes contradictory objects. The spatial dynamics of the Colosseum create additional performance pressure. The amphitheater's design ensures that spectators observe the combat from multiple angles simultaneously, making it impossible to present your best side or conceal technical mistakes. This 360-degree visibility means that momentary displays of fear, pain, or hesitation, natural responses to life-threatening situations, become immediately apparent to thousands of observers. Their disappointed reactions to such human vulnerability compounds your psychological burden, creating a feedback loop where awareness of being judged increases the very reactions being negatively judged. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain sections of Colosseum seating were allocated to specific social groups with distinct behavioral patterns. Whether accurate or not, you certainly notice regional variations in audience response. Military veterans in one section appreciating technical proficiency, wealthy patricians in another favoring dramatic flourishes, common citizens elsewhere responding primarily to displays of pain or courage. This fragmented audience creates conflicting performance demands impossible to satisfy simultaneously. The editor of the games, the wealthy patron financing today's spectacle, watches from his privileged position, his reactions carrying particular weight. You notice other gladiators occasionally glancing toward this important spectator, adjusting their performance based on his visible responses. This administrative oversight adds another layer of judgment beyond the general crowd, creating a dual audience with potentially divergent expectations. The editor seeks prestige through presenting memorable entertainment, his assessment of your performance potentially determining whether you receive mercy should you be defeated, but fight well enough to merit consideration. Historians continue to debate the exact frequency of deaths in gladiatorial combats, a scholarly voice might interject. Evidence suggests that trained gladiators represented significant investments and were not casually discarded through routine execution. This academic uncertainty provides cold comfort when you realize your survival may depend less on combat outcome than on subjective evaluation of your entertainment value. Fighting well but losing might result in mercy. Fighting poorly but winning might still end with execution if the crowd feels insufficiently entertained. The audience's mood proves dangerously volatile, shifting based on factors entirely outside your control. Earlier matches might have satisfied their bloodlust, or conversely whetted appetite for more extreme spectacle. Weather conditions affect collective comfort and patience. Recent political events or food shortages influence general temperament. These external factors create an unpredictable emotional baseline that may prove favorable or hostile to your particular performance, regardless of its objective quality. Your opponent, vastly more experienced in managing crowd dynamics, employs specific techniques to manipulate audience response. They occasionally pause after successful strikes, allowing spectators to fully appreciate their dominance. They execute unnecessarily elaborate movements between effective combat sequences, maintaining visual interest during tactical repositioning. They acknowledge particularly vocal sections of the crowd with subtle gestures, building personal connection that translates to support. These performance elements, entirely separate from combat effectiveness, represent a parallel skill set your training has barely addressed. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graveyards suggests that fatal injuries were often delivered with precise targeting of major blood vessels, a researcher might note. This clinical detail acquires disturbing significance when you realize experienced gladiators possess the skill to control not just whether their opponent died, but how they died, quickly and cleanly or through protracted suffering based on crowd preference. This capacity for calibrated violence represents yet another dimension of performance craft developed through numerous arena appearances. The symbolic elements of gladiatorial combat further complicate your survival equation. Different fighter types carried specific cultural associations. Thracians represented traditional enemies of Rome. Retiari symbolized fishermen catching human prey. Secutors embodied methodical pursuit. These symbolic roles created narrative expectations about how your combat should unfold, with audience disappointment resulting when performances deviated from anticipated pattern. Your opponent understands these expectations intimately. You're barely aware they exist. Time perception creates another audience-related challenge. What feels like continuous desperate struggle from your perspective appears as discrete entertainment segments to spectators. Periods of tactical assessment necessary for effective combat register as boring delays to observers expecting constant action. Your opponent manages this perception gap through performative elements during necessary pauses, adjusting equipment with flourish, acknowledging crowd sections with gestures, displaying wounds with stoic dignity. These theatrical interludes maintain audience engagement during combat's natural rhythms, another performance skill developed through experience rather than formal training. The acoustics of the Colosseum transform audience feedback into an almost physical force. Disapproving murmurs hit like waves of pressure. Approving roars provide momentary psychological buoyancy. This auditory environment creates emotional amplification, unlike anything in modern athletic competition, with collective judgment delivered at volume levels that penetrate conscious defensive barriers. The psychological impact compounds physical fatigue, creating performance deterioration that further diminishes audience approval in a downward spiral, familiar to your opponent but overwhelming to your novice sensibilities. Scholarly interpretation of surviving texts suggests gladiatorial combats followed loosely predictable narrative arcs, an academic might observe. This structural expectation manifests as subtle pressure to produce a satisfying story through your fighting, establishing character through initial exchanges, building tension through competitive balance, delivering climactic sequences that resolve narrative questions. Your opponent instinctively creates these storytelling elements. Your authentic survival struggle appears disjointed and unsatisfying by comparison. This narrative sophistication represents yet another evaluation dimension entirely separate from combat effectiveness. The most unpredictable audience influences emerge from factional dynamics. Gladiator schools developed devoted followings with fierce loyalty, supporters who attended games specifically to cheer representatives from their favored ludus. These factions often occupied specific sections of the Colosseum, creating regional response patterns that influenced overall crowd assessment. As a debuting fighter from your particular school, you inherit support or hostility based on your ludus reputation, rather than personal performance. Another arbitrary factor affecting survival chances independent of combat skill. The crowd's final judgment, should you find yourself defeated but still alive, follows cultural values alien to modern sensibilities. Courage overshadows skill. Entertaining failure outweighs boring success. Adherence to gladiatorial archetypes matters more than combat innovation. These evaluation criteria, developed through generations of spectator culture, create an assessment framework you haven't been culturally conditioned to understand, much less satisfy. Your opponent, having internalized these values through immersion in Roman society, intuitively produces the specific performance qualities most likely to generate positive audience response. As your match progresses and fatigue mounts, maintaining audience approval becomes increasingly challenging. Technical precision deteriorates, replaced by desperate improvisation that lacks the aesthetic qualities spectators expect. Pain and exhaustion register visibly despite attempts to maintain the stoic demeanor Romans admire. Your performance, judged against the polished presentations of experienced gladiators in previous matches, increasingly fails to meet the entertainment standards that might ensure mercy should combat skill prove insufficient for victory. This audience relationship, more complex than simple life or death struggle, represents perhaps the most alien aspect of gladiatorial combat to your modern sensibilities, a survival dimension for which no amount of physical training could adequately prepare you. The combat pauses momentarily as arena attendants rush out to rake the sand, smoothing areas disturbed by your struggle and ensuring optimal fighting conditions continue. This brief intermission reveals another dimension of gladiatorial reality invisible to spectators, but critical to your survival chances: the elaborate political machinery operating behind the arena spectacle. As you catch your breath, you notice subtle communication between your lanista and representatives of the editor, a wordless exchange that somehow concerns your performance thus far. Gladiatorial games functioned as complex political instruments in Roman society, a historical account might explain, with wealthy patrons using the arena to demonstrate power and curry public favor. What this academic observation fails to capture is how these political motivations create predetermined narratives that constrain actual combat outcomes regardless of fighter skill. Your match exists not merely as athletic competition, but as a carefully managed component of political theater, entertainment with predetermined parameters designed to satisfy multiple stakeholders, whose interests have nothing to do with fair combat. The editor of today's games, perhaps a senator seeking popular support, a wealthy merchant demonstrating civic contribution, or an imperial official managing public sentiment, has specific objectives beyond mere entertainment. A politically ambitious editor might require spectacular combats with emotional crowd engagement, prioritizing drama over technical quality. One seeking to demonstrate cultural sophistication might prefer historically authentic fighting styles with educational commentary between matches. An editor managing potentially restive populations during food shortages might emphasize the munificence of imperial provision through particularly generous events. These political objectives translate to practical directives communicated to your Lannister before the games and reinforced through subtle signals during performances. If today's political narrative requires inspiring displays of mercy, your life might be spared despite poor performance. Conversely, if demonstrating strict justice serves the editor's purposes, even an exemplary showing might end with execution. This arbitrary relationship between performance and outcome undermines the supposed meritocracy of arena combat, creating a survival dimension entirely beyond your control. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain matches may have been partially choreographed or subject to predetermined outcomes, particularly when featuring imperial favorites or when specific political messages required reinforcement. Whether your particular combat falls into this category becomes apparent when you land a particularly effective strike against your opponent, only to have the referee, summa rudis, immediately intervene with questionable justification, allowing your adversary crucial recovery time. This subtle manipulation reveals the invisible scaffolding, supporting what appears to spectators as authentic contest. The political dimension extends beyond match outcomes to fighter presentation. Your arrival in the arena included equipment displays and introductory ceremonies designed to establish narrative context for spectators. The announcer emphasized aspects of your background that support today's thematic programming, perhaps exaggerating your foreign origins if you're cast as a barbarian opponent, or highlighting tenuous connections to historical military traditions if today's games commemorate specific Roman victories. This managed identity, crafted to serve political messaging rather than reflect reality, creates another layer of performance pressure as you struggle to embody a fabricated persona. Historians continue to debate the extent of corruption in gladiatorial combat, a scholarly voice might eject, with evidence suggesting occasional match-fixing despite official prohibitions. This academic uncertainty materializes as practical danger when you notice your opponent receiving almost imperceptible guidance from the referee, subtle hand signals suggesting tactical adjustments or indicating when to escalate or moderate aggression. These interventions, invisible to most spectators, reveal how thoroughly external factors may determine your survival regardless of combat performance. The economics of gladiatorial combat introduce additional political complications. Your Lannister has invested substantially in your training and maintenance, creating financial interest in your continued survival if you've shown potential profit-generating ability. Conversely, if your performance suggests limited commercial viability, his signals to the editor might actually encourage decisive rather than merciful judgment. This cold calculation places financial return above fighting merit, another non-combat factor determining your fate. Social hierarchies visible in seating arrangements further illustrate the political nature of the games. The closest seats, podium, reserved for senators, vestal virgins, and high officials. The next sections, Manianum Primum, accommodate equestrians and respected citizens. Common Romans occupy middle levels, Manianum Secundum, while women and the poorest citizens watch from the highest tiers, Manianum Summum. This physical stratification reminds all present that the games reinforce existing social order rather than challenging it through genuine meritocratic competition. Archaeological findings confirm sophisticated administrative systems supporting gladiatorial games, a researcher might note. with evidence of detailed record-keeping tracking fighter statistics. This organizational backdrop manifests as the career managers visibly assessing your performance from privileged viewing positions, noting crowd reactions to specific techniques, evaluating your commercial potential, determining your future match assignments based on entertainment value rather than competitive fairness. Their assessment, entirely separate from combat outcome, may influence whether you face appropriately matched opponents in future or are sacrificed against superior fighters for dramatic spectacle. The political messaging extends to the treatment of defeated gladiators. A thumb turned down, or in historical reality, possibly thumb extended, from the editor carries significance beyond individual fate, communicating broader values regarding justice, mercy, martial virtue, or social hierarchy. If today's political climate requires demonstrations of imperial clemency, your life might be spared despite unimpressive performance. If reinforcing martial discipline serves current messaging needs, even a valiant showing might end with execution. This arbitrary relationship between merit and outcome undermines any notion of arena combat as genuine athletic competition. Religious elements introduce another political dimension, with games often dedicated to specific deities or imperial cults. Your combat occurs within ceremonial context, including prayers, sacrifices, and ritual processions designed to associate political authorities with divine favor. This religious framing transforms your life or death struggle into sacred drama, where outcomes supposedly reflect divine judgment rather than human skill or political convenience. A narrative that conveniently absolves authorities of responsibility for arena fatalities while reinforcing their claimed connection to supernatural authority. The imperial presence, whether actual or symbolic through representatives, creates the ultimate political constraint on combat outcomes. If the emperor or his official shows interest in a particular fighter, that gladiators' survival chances increase dramatically, regardless of performance quality. Conversely, imperial disfavor can doom even the most skilled combatants. This arbitrary influence, entirely independent of combat merit, epitomizes the fundamentally political nature of an institution, ostensibly celebrating martial prowess, but actually reinforcing established power structures. Propaganda objectives further distort competitive authenticity. If current imperial messaging emphasizes Roman supremacy over specific conquered peoples, fighters representing those ethnicities will consistently face disadvantageous matches designed to demonstrate their inferiority. If domestic political tensions require reinforcing traditional values, combats may be arranged to showcase fighters embodying those virtues against opponents representing perceived societal threats. These narrative requirements create predetermined favoritism or disadvantage entirely separate from fighter quality. As the arena attendants complete their sand-raking and combat resumes, you realize fully how thoroughly political considerations permeate every aspect of gladiatorial spectacle. Your survival depends not merely on combat skill, audience entertainment, or even random chance, but on your utility within complex political narratives invisible to spectators, but determining the parameters within which actual competition occurs. This realization brings neither comfort nor tactical advantage. Merely bitter understanding that your life hangs on calculations made in shadowy conversations between powerful men whose interests have nothing to do with fighting merit, and everything to do with maintaining systems of power for which the arena itself serves merely as elaborate staging. Your unexpected survival of your debut match brings momentary relief quickly replaced by sobering realization. Fame in the arena is a double-edged gladius. As your name appears on promotional announcements for upcoming games, the stone tablets and painted notices around Rome identifying you as the victor of the September Games, or some equally grandiose title, you discover that success carries dangers potentially exceeding those faced by anonymous novices. Successful gladiators achieved celebrity status comparable to modern sports stars, a historical account might note, with dedicated fan followings and commercial endorsement opportunities. What this sanitized academic observation fails to capture is how this fame creates escalating survival challenges entirely separate from combat skill development. Your victory has transformed you from expendable novice to potentially valuable entertainment property, a status that paradoxically increases rather than decreases the mortal danger you face. The first concrete manifestation of this paradox arrives with your next match assignment. Rather than facing another novice of comparable experience, a logical progression allowing skill development, you find yourself scheduled against a significantly more accomplished opponent. Your lanista explains this matchup not as punitive, but as opportunity. The crowd remembers your name now. They expect something special. This accelerated challenge progression reflects entertainment demands rather than athletic development protocols, creating artificially intensified danger that would never occur in modern competitive sports. Fame generates specific combat disadvantages beyond accelerated opposition. Your previous matches are now studied by potential opponents and their trainers, your techniques analyzed for patterns and vulnerabilities invisible to casual observers, but exploitable by experienced fighters. This asymmetrical preparation, they know your tendencies while you encounter their fighting style for the first time in the arena, creates tactical disadvantages entirely separate from raw skill differential. Your success has transformed you from unknown quantity to specifically targeted opponent. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that particularly popular gladiators may have been subjected to distinctive promotional expectations, including participation in exhibition matches against exotic animals or multiple simultaneous opponents. Whether factual or merely speculative, you certainly notice changing performance expectations as your recognition increases. Your lanista emphasizes visual distinctiveness, perhaps a unique helmet decoration or characteristic fighting technique, creating marketable identity at the expense of tactical effectiveness. The economic dimension of gladiatorial fame introduces additional survival complications. As your commercial value increases, various stakeholders develop financial interests in your career trajectory. Your lanista now considers not just combat outcomes, but entertainment value when assessing your performance. The editor who sponsors your appearances expects return on investment through memorable spectacles rather than technical excellence. Gambling interests, substantial in Roman society, prefer dramatic, uncertain contests over displays of dominant skill. These commercial pressures collectively push toward more dangerous, crowd-pleasing performances rather than safety-oriented technical mastery. Historians continue to debate the average career duration of successful gladiators. A scholarly voice might interject, with estimates ranging from 10 to 15 combat appearances for those surviving their initial matches. This academic uncertainty acquires personal urgency as you realize your growing reputation accelerates rather than extends this limited performance window. Each victory increases audience expectations for your next appearance, creating unsustainable progression toward increasingly dangerous matchups, regardless of your actual skill development. The psychological burden of fame creates performance challenges invisible to spectators, but potentially fatal in combat context. Awareness of public recognition generates pressure to maintain the fighting style that brought initial success, discouraging tactical adaptation even when circumstances demand flexibility. The expectation to perform signature techniques becomes particularly dangerous when opponents specifically prepare counters to these movements. This stylistic inflexibility, demanded by audience expectations, transforms your greatest strengths into predictable vulnerabilities. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graveyards reveals that even successful fighters eventually succumbed to combat injuries, a researcher might note. with skeletal remains showing accumulated trauma patterns consistent with repeated serious wounds. This clinical observation translates to the disturbing realization that survival isn't binary but incremental, each match extracting physical costs that accumulate toward inevitable decline, regardless of nominal victory. Fame accelerates this deterioration by increasing both frequency and intensity of combat exposure beyond sustainable levels. The social dimension of gladiatorial celebrity introduces unexpected dangers beyond the arena itself. Popular fighters become subjects of intense public interest, sometimes gaining limited freedom to move through Roman society between matches. This partial integration creates vulnerability to exploitation by citizens seeking association with arena celebrities, offering poisoned wine during celebratory gatherings, arranging accidental injuries before important matches, or simply wearing down physical resources through excessive socialization. These external threats, entirely absent for anonymous fighters confined to the ludus, represent collateral dangers accompanying fame. Fame-driven match programming creates particularly insidious survival challenges through specialized opponent selection. As your reputation centers on specific fighting attributes, perhaps speed, power, or technical precision, match arrangers deliberately select opponents whose characteristics neutralize these advantages. This customized opposition, designed to create dramatic tension rather than showcase skill, ensures that even as your abilities increase, your survival probability remains relatively constant through progressively challenging matchups specifically engineered to exploit your particular vulnerabilities. The ultimate expression of fame-driven danger manifests in specialized combat formats reserved for popular fighters. The sine missione match, combat without mercy, where defeated gladiators cannot receive clemency regardless of performance quality, becomes more frequent as your celebrity increases. Exhibition fights against exotic animals, lions, bears, or crocodiles, against which traditional fighting techniques prove largely ineffective, offer novelty to audiences bored with conventional matches. Specialized handicap scenarios, fighting multiple opponents simultaneously or with intentionally inadequate equipment, create artificial disadvantages designed to maximize dramatic tension rather than showcase actual skill. Scholarly analysis of surviving promotional materials suggests that certain gladiators were marketed through carefully constructed narratives, an academic might observe, with fighting styles and personal histories shaped to maximize audience engagement. This marketing dimension manifests as pressure to maintain character consistency even when tactically disadvantageous, continuing aggressive approaches that initially captured audience imagination even against opponents specifically selected to punish such aggression. This narrative prison transforms successful fighters into caricatures of themselves, their tactical options increasingly constrained by audience expectations. Perhaps most insidious among fame-related dangers is the comprehensive intelligence gathering directed towards successful fighters. Trainers from competing schools attend your matches, documenting specific techniques, timing patterns, and psychological triggers. Physicians note which injuries affect your performance most significantly. Even arena staff observe your pre-combat rituals and between-match recovery methods. This collective surveillance creates comprehensive vulnerability profiles unavailable for anonymous fighters, ensuring that future opponents enter the arena with detailed exploitation strategies tailored specifically to your documented weaknesses. As your reputation continues growing, you notice subtle changes in how competing gladiators approach matches against you. Beyond simply studying your techniques, they now specifically target the story of defeating the famous fighter, seeking not just victory, but narrative significance that might transfer your celebrity status to themselves through dramatic conquest. This targeted opposition creates risk asymmetry, where your defeat carries career-defining importance for opponents, while representing merely another performance for you. A motivation differential that translates to dangerous intensity disparities in actual combat exchanges. The final paradox of gladiatorial fame emerges through its relationship with retirement prospects. The wooden rudies, ceremonial wooden sword signifying honorable discharge, theoretically becomes more attainable as your victory count increases. In practice, however, your growing economic value creates institutional resistance to your retirement regardless of achievement. Your lanista, having invested years developing your marketable skills and persona, has financial incentive to extend your performing career beyond reasonable physical limits. This conflict between achievement and exploitation ensures that the most famous fighters often remain in the arena long after their bodies have accumulated damage, rendering safe performance impossible. A final fatal consequence of success in Rome's most merciless entertainment industry. The wooden sword rests on a velvet cushion, its simple form belying its profound significance. The rudies, symbol of honorable discharge from gladiatorial service, represents freedom from the arena's perpetual mortal jeopardy. As you witness a grizzled veteran receive this ceremonial token during rare retirement proceedings, the reality of gladiatorial career trajectories crystallizes with stark clarity. The statistical improbability of your ever holding such a sword yourself approaches mathematical certainty. Manumission through the wooden sword represented the pinnacle of gladiatorial achievement, a historical account might explain, with successful fighters earning freedom after substantial victory records. What this sanitized academic observation fails to capture is how systematically the entire gladiatorial infrastructure works against fighters ever reaching this milestone. The mathematical reality of survival rates creates a funnel of diminishing probability that narrows with each arena appearance, regardless of skill, fame, or pate. The baseline numbers tell a grim story, even before considering complicating facts. Ancient sources suggest that approximately 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 gladiators died during each combat appearance. Even assuming the more favorable ratio and consistent combat skill, simple probability calculations reveal the cumulative survival odds. After 5 fights, your survival probability drops below 60%. After 10 matches, below 35%. After 15 appearances, below 20%. These cold statistics suggest most fighters would perish long before accumulating the substantial victory record required for freedom consideration. These baseline calculations assume fair matches between equally prepared opponents, an assumption almost never realized in actual practice. Match programming deliberately creates narrative tension through uneven pairings, often sacrificing technical fairness for entertainment value. Successful fighters face progressively more challenging opponents, artificially maintaining consistent death risk despite skill improvement. This managed difficulty progression ensures that survival probability remains relatively constant regardless of experience, creating a nearly insurmountable statistical barrier between combatants and retirement. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain ludus operations may have employed mathematical systems for calculating fighter value and likely career duration. Whether formalized or intuitive, these assessment frameworks clearly prioritized maximum economic extraction over fighter longevity. Why grant retirement to a profitable combatant when additional matches might generate further revenue? This economic logic creates institutional resistance to manumission, entirely separate from performance metrics, inserting commercial considerations into what officially appears as merit-based achievement progression. The retirement ceremony you witness reveals another dimension of the system's inherent resistance to fighter freedom. The aged veteran receiving his rudies represents an outlier so statistically exceptional as to be nearly miraculous. A fighter who survived somewhere between 20-40 combat appearances against progressively more challenging opposition. His heavily scarred body tells the story of innumerable near-death experiences survived through some combination of skill, adaptability, and simple fortune. This physical condition itself represents another barrier to freedom, as cumulative injuries eventually diminish performance below commercially viable levels, regardless of nominal victory record. Historians continue to debate the exact criteria for gladiatorial retirement. A scholarly voice might interject, with evidence suggesting variable standards based on performance quality rather than simple victory tallies. This academic uncertainty manifests as practical insecurity for active fighters who receive only vague indications of their progress toward potential freedom. Without transparent achievement metrics, gladiators cannot effectively track their advancement toward manumission goals that remain deliberately ambiguous. Another system feature that serves management interests by maintaining fighter motivation while minimizing actual freedom grants. The legal dimension of gladiatorial retirement introduces additional complications. Fighters originating from slave status, the vast majority, require formal manumission from their legal owners, a process entirely separate from arena retirement. A gladiator might receive the ceremonial rudies, yet remain legally enslaved, with freedom extending only to arena combat exemption rather than actual liberty. This legal technicality creates situations where retired fighters continue serving their lanista in training or administrative capacities, despite nominal retirement, a cost-saving measure that maintains access to their expertise while circumventing the economic loss their genuine freedom would represent. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graveyards reveals that many fighters who survived their active careers eventually died from complications of accumulated combat injuries, a researcher might note. This clinical observation translates to the disturbing realization that formal retirement often comes only when physical deterioration renders further performance impossible. Freedom granted not as reward for achievement, but as disposal mechanism for fighters whose bodies can no longer generate revenue. The retirement ceremony thus frequently represents not career culmination, but the beginning of abbreviated post-combat decline, as accumulated trauma manifests in chronic health conditions. The psychological dimension of gladiatorial retirement presents yet another barrier to freedom. After years of identity formation centered entirely on arena performance, many fighters develop institutionalized mentality similar to modern prisoners serving extended sentences. The prospect of civilian reintegration, navigating Roman society without the structured environment and clear success metrics of gladiatorial life, creates anxiety that sometimes manifests as reluctance to pursue retirement despite survival prospects. This psychological barrier serves management interests by reducing freedom-seeking behavior among fighters theoretically eligible for consideration. For fighters who overcome these multiple barriers and achieve genuine manumission, post-gladiatorial life introduces challenges entirely separate from combat survival. With minimal transferable skills beyond violence, limited social connections outside arena culture, and bodies typically compromised by accumulated injuries, retired gladiators face difficult economic prospects. Many remain connected to the ludus system through training positions, equipment maintenance, or promotional activities, a dependency relationship that limits their genuine autonomy despite technical freedom. This restricted post-career opportunity landscape serves as implicit discouragement against pursuing retirement among active fighters, witnessing the challenging transitions of their freed counterparts. The commercial infrastructure surrounding gladiatorial combat creates additional resistance to fighter retirement. Successful combatants develop fan followings that translate directly to ticket sales and sponsorship opportunities. Managers, trainers, sponsors, and facility operators all derive economic benefit from popular fighters' continued performance, creating a network of stakeholders with vested interest in delaying or preventing retirement regardless of achievement metrics. This commercial pressure sometimes manifests as retirement ceremonies for fighters who continue performing in exhibition matches. Technical freedom, accompanied by practical continuation of hazardous performance obligations through financial necessity or contractual requirements. Scholarly interpretation of surviving texts suggests that gladiatorial retirement ceremonies served important symbolic functions in Roman society, an academic might observe, reinforcing values of merit-based advancement while showcasing imperial or elite generosity. This propaganda dimension explains the public, ceremonial nature of the Rudy's presentation you witness, a spectacle designed less to honor individual achievement than to legitimize the gladiatorial system itself by highlighting its theoretical reward structure. The exceptional rarity of these ceremonies serves commercial interests by maintaining the apparent value of freedom through artificial scarcity while minimizing actual manumission frequency. As the retirement ceremony concludes and the veteran gladiator departs the arena for the final time, you calculate your own progress toward this theoretically achievable milestone. With perhaps 3 victories against novice opponents comparable to yourself, you've barely begun the statistical journey toward the 15-25 wins, typically preceding freedom consideration. Each future match will present greater challenges, specifically calibrated to maintain consistent death probability, regardless of skill development. Your body already carries minor but permanent damage that will compound with each subsequent appearance. The economic incentives of every stakeholder in the system align against your eventual retirement. The wooden sword disappears from view as arena attendants prepare for the next combat. Its brief appearance served its ceremonial purpose, maintaining the theoretical possibility of freedom that motivates fighter performance, while obscuring the mathematical reality that transforms this possibility into practical impossibility for all but statistical anomalies. The Rudy's returns to storage until the next exceedingly rare retirement ceremony, its symbolic power dependent on perpetual visibility combined with actual unavailability, the perfect emblem of a system designed to extract maximum value from human resources through managed hope, calibrated against overwhelming statistical certainty. Your smartphone won't save you in the Colosseum. This realization strikes with particular force during your 3rd arena appearance, when a moment of genuine inspiration hits. You recall a sword technique from a historical European martial arts video you once watched. The move, theoretically sound and potentially effective, falls apart mid-execution as your body struggles to translate modern conceptual understanding into ancient physical reality without the thousands of repetitions necessary for genuine combat implementation. Transferable skills from contemporary life would prove largely irrelevant in gladiatorial contexts, a historical account might have. This academic understatement fails to capture the profound disadvantage your modern background creates despite apparent advantages in education and analytics. The skills defining success in your 21st century existence, perhaps digital literacy, abstract problem solving, or specialized professional knowledge, become instantly irrelevant in an environment that ruthlessly prioritizes physical capabilities developed through lifetime practice in pre-industrial conditions. Your modern understanding of human physiology, while vastly exceeding Roman knowledge, provides surprisingly little combat advantage. Theoretical awareness of anatomical vulnerabilities, major arteries, nerve clusters, structural weaknesses, doesn't translate to practical targeting ability without the muscle memory developed through thousands of practice repetitions. Knowing intellectually where to strike proves entirely different from possessing the trained capacity to execute such strikes against active resistance from an opponent whose entire physical development has oriented toward preventing exactly such attacks. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain gladiatorial techniques resembled modern martial arts principles, potentially offering familiar reference points for contemporary practitioners. Whether accurate or not, any superficial similarities quickly prove misleading when attempted in actual combat. The weight distribution of ancient weapons, The movement restrictions of historical armor and the environmental conditions of arena sand create a fighting context so fundamentally different from modern martial arts that theoretical similarities become practical liabilities when they generate false confidence in inapplicable technique. The psychological dimension of combat creates another area where modern advantages become ancient liabilities. Contemporary life rarely exposes individuals to genuine mortal danger, creating psychological landscapes defined by abstract stressors rather than immediate survival threats. This developmental difference manifests as freezing responses, cognitive overload, or panic reactions when facing direct physical aggression. Stress responses invisible in training environments but catastrophically evident in actual combat. Your modern nervous system, calibrated for social threats rather than physical ones, betrays you precisely when survival requires instantaneous, effective action. Historians continue to debate the relative efficacy of formal training versus practical experience in gladiatorial development, a scholarly voice might interject. This academic discussion acquires immediate relevance when you discover that your carefully practiced technical sequences disintegrate under actual combat pressure, replaced by instinctive movements emerging from your developmental background. Unfortunately, these instincts formed through modern experiences bear little relevance to ancient combat reality, creating responses optimized for environments that don't exist in the Roman. Your contemporary fitness training, potentially substantial by modern standards, proves inadequately specialized for gladiatorial demands. Modern exercise typically emphasizes balanced development, cardiovascular efficiency, and aesthetic appearance, priorities misaligned with combat-specific capabilities. Romans from physical labor backgrounds developed specialized strength profiles, wrists conditioned through craft work, shoulders strengthened by agricultural tasks, legs stabilized through daily walking on uneven surfaces. These targeted physical adaptations, accumulated through lifetime practical activity rather than intentional exercise, create functional advantages no modern fitness program could replicate without years of specialized training. Archaeological analysis of Gladiator remains reveals distinctive bone density and injury patterns consistent with specialized physical development, a researcher might note. This clinical observation translates to the practical reality that your skeletal structure itself represents a modern liability. Contemporary life, with its ergonomic accommodations, mechanical transportation, and reduced physical demands, creates bone density and muscle attachment development markedly different from ancient norms. These structural differences manifest as increased fracture susceptibility, reduced impact tolerance, and compromised leverage generation in direct combat applications. The cognitive dimension potentially represents your most significant modern advantage, but one that proves surprisingly difficult to leverage effectively. Your understanding of strategy, pattern recognition capabilities, and analytical thinking might theoretically create tactical superiority. In practice, however, the compressed timeframes of combat decision-making neutralize these advantages by requiring reactions faster than conscious thought processes can influence. When attack recognition and response must occur within fractions of seconds, the analytical mind becomes a spectator to instinctive responses determined by physical training rather than cognitive capability. Modern communication expectations create another surprising liability in gladiatorial context. Contemporary social interaction emphasizes verbal exchange, facial expression, and explicit communication, patterns notably absent in combat environments, requiring nonverbal awareness and implicit understanding. Your attention habitually focuses on verbal cues and facial indicators while missing subtle physical tells, weight shifts, breathing changes, muscular preparations, that telegraph opponent intentions to fighters developed in less verbally oriented cultural contexts. This attentional mismatch creates perpetual information disadvantage regardless of theoretical combat knowledge. Scholarly interpretation of gladiatorial training texts suggests emphasis on standardized response patterns rather than creative improvisation, an academic might observe. This training philosophy directly counters modern valorization of innovation and adaptability, creating conflict between your instinctive approach to problem solving and the Roman emphasis on perfected execution of established techniques. Your tendency toward creative adaptation represents liability rather than advantage when combat effectiveness depends on flawless implementation of proven methods rather than novel approaches with untested efficacy. The technological foundations of modern life create perhaps the most profound disadvantage in ancient combat contexts. Contemporary existence builds upon layers of technological mediation that distance individuals from direct physical interaction with their environment, creating cognitive and neurological adaptations optimized for technology-assisted existence. These adaptations manifest as slightly delayed physical response times, attentional patterns oriented toward explicit rather than implicit information, and decision processes dependent on more complete information than combat scenarios provide. These modern characteristics, invisible in everyday contexts, become critical liabilities when survival depends on immediate, decisive physical action, based on incomplete sensory information. Social conditioning represents another dimension, where modern backgrounds create ancient disadvantages. Contemporary socialization emphasizes conflict avoidance, emotional regulation, and violence suppression, adaptive characteristics for functioning within ordered societies, but directly counterproductive in combat contexts requiring immediate aggression. Your hesitation before delivering potentially lethal strikes, momentary flinching when receiving incoming attacks, and instinctive recoil from causing serious injury reflect deeply internalized modern social norms that directly compromise survival probability in gladiatorial contexts where such hesitation creates fatal vulnerability. Archaeological evidence indicates that successful gladiators often began combat training in childhood, a researcher might note, with neurological development occurring within contexts of normalized violence and physical risk. This developmental trajectory stands in stark contrast to modern upbringing prioritizing safety, psychological security, and protected maturation. The resulting differences extend beyond conscious attitudes to include fundamental neurological organization, attention distribution, threat response patterning, and sensory prioritization optimized for entirely different environmental demands than those presented in arena combat. Perhaps most problematically, your modern identity itself becomes liability rather than asset in gladiatorial contexts. Contemporary self-conception typically centers on internal characteristics, personality, values, knowledge, social connections, rather than physical capabilities or survival functions. This identity structure creates fundamental vulnerability when thrust into environments where physical performance constitutes the primary value determinant. Your automatic self-narrative emphasizes aspects irrelevant to arena survival while undervaluing the physical attributes and combat capabilities representing the only meaningful currency in gladiatorial evaluation systems. As your third arena match progresses toward its inevitable conclusion, the comprehensive nature of your modern disadvantage becomes increasingly apparent. Each attempted application of contemporary knowledge or skill, whether biomechanical insight, strategic analysis, or psychological technique, fails to translate into effective combat application without the years of specialized physical development supporting such implementation. The gap between knowing and embodying, between understanding and executing, between modern conceptual framework and ancient physical reality, ultimately proves unbridgeable within the compressed time frame, separating your arrival in Rome and your final gladiatorial performance. The sand feels different beneath your feet, perhaps more densely packed, or slightly moister from the morning's preparation. Such minute environmental variations would have passed unnoticed when you first entered the arena months ago. Now, these subtle differences register as critical tactical information, evidence of how thoroughly this ancient world has rewritten your perceptual priorities. This transformation, from modern observer to embedded participant, represents your final evolution in a journey destined to end where so many gladiatorial careers conclude, in the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. The average gladiatorial career spanned approximately 3 to 5 years, a historical account might, with most fighters participating in 10 to 15 combats before death or retirement. What this clinical observation fails to capture is how this statistical inevitability manifests as lived experience, the gradual accumulation of physical damage, psychological wear, and diminishing survival probability that characterizes your final confrontation with historical reality. Time traveler or not, the arena eventually claims its due. Your opponent today represents everything you are not. A lifetime product of Roman society, body developed through agricultural labor before gladiatorial training, fighting instincts honed through dozens of combat appearances. The matchmakers have paired you deliberately, your modern-turned gladiator novelty against his classical archetype, a narrative contrast designed to entertain the massive audience surrounding you. Their expectations weigh as heavily as your armor, the crowd's desire for spectacular conclusion, adding psychological burden to physical challenge. Some fringe archaeological evidence suggests that certain gladiatorial matches may have involved elaborate staging beyond simple combat, thematic presentations involving narrative elements or theatrical components. Whether historically accurate or not, your final appearance certainly includes such embellishments. Arena attendants have created a simplified landscape suggesting foreign territory, perhaps Germania or Britannia, establishing narrative context for a battle between Roman virtue, your opponent, and barbarian aggression, you, the time-displaced outsider. This manufactured symbolism transforms personal survival struggle into public morality play, adding layer of performative expectation to already overwhelming combat demands. The first exchange reveals how thoroughly your body has changed during your gladiatorial tenure. Movements that once required conscious direction now flow automatically, trained responses emerging without deliberate thought. Your shield rises instinctively to block overhead strikes. Your weight shifts, anticipate direction changes without conscious calculation. This physical transformation, profound by modern standards, but insufficient by Roman ones, represents both your greatest achievement and your fundamental limitation. You've become something your modern self would consider extraordinary, while remaining decidedly ordinary by gladiatorial standards. Historians continue to debate the psychological impact of repeated mortal combat exposure. A scholarly voice might interject. This academic question finds concrete answer in your emotional landscape during this final battle. The paralyzing fear experienced during your first arena appearance has transmuted into something more complex, situational awareness heightened by danger but no longer clouded by panic, acceptance of potential outcomes without surrender to them, recognition of mortality without capitulation to its inevitability. This psychological adaptation, remarkable by modern standards, merely represents baseline functionality in an environment where fear-paralyzed fighters perish immediately. Your combat technique reflects curious hybrid development, modern analytical understanding imperfectly grafted onto Roman physical training. Occasional movements betray your time-displaced origins, a parry influenced by Olympic fencing principles, footwork momentarily resembling modern martial arts patterns, weight transfers suggesting contemporary athletic training. These anomalies, barely perceptible to observers but starkly evident to your opponent, create both tactical vulnerabilities and occasional advantages through their unpredictability. You fight like no one entirely of this time, for better and worse. Archaeological examination of Gladiator remains reveals distinctive patterns of healed injuries, suggesting experienced fighters developed individualized adaptations to compensate for accumulated physical damage, a researcher might observe. This clinical detail materializes in your combat movements, now unconsciously modified to accommodate permanent injuries acquired through previous matches, slightly reduced rotation in your left shoulder, marginally compromised weight bearing on your right knee, subtle favoring of your dominant side, following rib fractures that healed. These adaptations extract progressive tax on performance capabilities regardless of skill development. The crowd's reaction provides continuous commentary on your performance, approving roars when you execute particularly Roman techniques, confused murmurs when your modern influence manifests in unorthodox movements. This feedback, once overwhelming, now registers as ambient information rather than psychological distraction. Your attention remains primarily focused on the immediate survival problem presented by your opponent, broader context acknowledged but relegated to secondary awareness. This attentional discipline, hard-won through arena experience, represents perhaps your most significant adaptation to gladiatorial reality. The physical toll of combat accumulates with methodical certainty. Respiratory rate increases beyond sustainable levels. Lactic acid builds in muscle tissue. Minor injuries create progressive performance decrements. These biological realities transcend historical periods, as relevant in the Colosseum as in modern athletic competition, though with dramatically different stakes. Your opponent, conditioned through lifetime physical development for precisely these demands, maintains functional output with marginally greater efficiency. This slight differential gradually compounds, creating widening performance gap as the match continues. Scholarly analysis suggests gladiatorial combat included tactical phases similar to modern competitive fighting sports, an academic might note. This theoretical comparison acquires practical dimension as your match transitions between engagement stages, initial assessment exchanges giving way to committed offensive sequences, followed by defensive preservation during fatigue, culminating in desperation tactics as resources deplete. This progression, familiar to fighters across history, unfolds with particular intensity when mortality, rather than points, motivates each decision. Your recognition of these phases, informed by both modern understanding and acquired arena experience, creates momentary advantage through anticipation of transitional vulnerabilities. The sensory experience of combat encompasses dimensions entirely absent from historical accounts. The distinctive sounds of different weapons striking various armor materials. The olfactory assault of blood, sweat, and dust, creating metallic organic fragrance, unique to arena combat. The proprioceptive awareness of your body in space, simultaneously hyper-present and strangely distant through adrenaline's perceptual distortions. These sensations, impossible to fully communicate to anyone outside gladiatorial experience, constitute the phenomenological reality beneath abstract historical reconstructions of ancient combat. Your modern knowledge provides final contributions as the combat reaches critical stage. Biomechanical understanding identifies the most efficient striking angles given your respective positions. Psychological insight recognizes fatigue-induced patterns in your opponent's technique. Statistical awareness calculates probability distributions for various tactical options. These analytical advantages, marginally useful within combat's compressed timeframes, create occasional openings that extend your performance beyond what purely traditional training might achieve, sufficient to demonstrate respectable showing, but inadequate to overcome the cumulative advantages of lifetime Roman development. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graves reveals that many fighters received honorable burial with grave goods, suggesting societal respect, a researcher might observe. This potential posthumous dignity offers cold comfort as your match approaches its inevitable conclusion. The efficiency differential between your hybrid modern Roman capabilities and your opponent's thoroughly traditional development manifests as progressive performance deterioration. technical precision diminishes with fatigue, creating expanding vulnerability windows. Reaction time extends slightly with each exchange, transforms survivable threats into eventually unavoidable damage. These marginal decrements compound toward threshold, where combat viability collapses entirely. The final sequence unfolds with almost mathematical certainty, not through lack of skill or effort, but through culmination of accumulated variables determining outcome probability from the match's beginning. A momentary overextension, slightly delayed recovery, fractionally misjudged distance. Individual components remain within normal performance variation, but their specific combination creates critical vulnerability precisely when your opponent retains capacity to exploit it effectively. The decisive strike registers first as tactical recognition before physical sensation follows, awareness of irrecoverable position preceding actual damage. As you fall to the sand, time briefly dilates through neurochemical response to critical injury. Your perception registers previously unnoticed details. Individual dust particles catching sunlight, specific facial expressions among nearest spectators, the particular pattern of clouds visible above the Colosseum's partial awning. This perceptual expansion, product of neurological survival mechanism rather than spiritual transformation, creates momentary illusion of extended time within which to comprehend your historical position. A temporal anomaly reaching final integration with the reality it temporarily inhabited. The crowd's reaction washes over you in waves, their judgment determining whether conclusion comes immediately or receives temporary postponement through mercy. Their response, respect for determined performance rather than disappointment with technical shortcomings, transforms into fluctuating thumb gestures directed toward the editor. This final arbitrary judgment, rendered by audience members who will shortly depart for your match representing merely momentary entertainment, determines whether your Roman experience concludes immediately or receives brief extension. As darkness begins encroaching on your peripheral vision, your modern consciousness offers final reflection on this impossible historical journey. You've experienced what countless researchers, historians, and enthusiasts could only theorize about: the lived reality of gladiatorial combat beyond academic reconstruction. This knowledge, acquired at ultimate cost, contains truth inaccessible through conventional historical methods. The phenomenological reality of ancient combat experience, the sensory dimensions absent from textual accounts, the psychological landscape of ritualized mortality confrontation. This unique perspective, profound beyond scholarly comparison, accompanies you into approaching darkness, final understanding achieved precisely when capacity to communicate it expires. The sand absorbs your blood, as it has countless gladiators before you, the Colosseum claiming another sacrifice to its eternal spectacle. History continues its predetermined course, momentarily accommodating your anomalous presence before closing seamlessly around your departure. In archives millennia hence, your name might appear on recovered fight records, perhaps with notation of unusual fighting style or uncommon origin story. Minor mysteries for future researchers who cannot possibly suspect the temporal truth of your brief, doomed participation in history's most renowned combat spectacle. As your awareness fades, the sounds of the Colosseum gradually soften, crowd noise receding, armor impacts diminishing, your own heartbeat slowing towards silence. The harsh Mediterranean sun that welcomed you to ancient Rome provides final sensation as its warmth touches your face one last time. The world of gladiators, emperors, and eternal Rome dissolves into approaching darkness, your impossible historical journey, concluding where probability always suggested it would, in the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. One more statistical certainty in the ruthless mathematics of gladiatorial survival. The circle completes itself as your consciousness dims, modern mind having briefly experienced ancient reality before surrendering to historical inevitability. Your final thought forms with surprising clarity. Despite everything you learned, everything you adapted to, everything you became, history always retained the advantage. Like countless gladiators whose remains lie beneath Rome's modern streets, you've discovered the ultimate historical truth. The past remains undefeated against all who dare to challenge it directly. Now, as your consciousness drifts toward darkness, your breathing slows, your muscles relax, and your mind gradually releases its grip on this ancient world. The sounds of the arena grow distant, like waves receding from shore. The pain that seemed so immediate moments ago fades into a gentle numbness that spreads through your limbs. Your thoughts, once racing with strategies and survival calculations, now move like clouds across a summer sky, unhurried, peaceful, free from urgency. With each heartbeat, the space between moments grows longer. The weight of your armor seems to dissolve, and the coarse sand beneath your body feels increasingly distant. The bright Roman sun that once seemed harsh now bathes everything in a warm, golden glow that softens all edges and smooths all transitions. Time stretches and bends, each second expanding to contain entire worlds of sensation and memory. As you exhale one final breath, a profound sense of completion settles over you. You have lived what others could only imagine, experienced what countless historians could only theorize about. In these final moments, there is no regret, no resistance, only acceptance of this most authentic conclusion to your extraordinary journey through time. The darkness that approaches no longer seems threatening, but welcoming, like closing your eyes after a long day. Your consciousness gently releases its hold on this ancient world as you drift into the most peaceful sleep you've ever known.